Hello, friends. Welcome to my shed. I am Chevee, and I hope you're doing great today. Give you a warning before I start. This episode it's not going to be happy. It's not going to make you smile. I might cry. Probably will. And it might put you in a sour mood. And so if you're not interested in any of that, please don't watch it. Click on this link and you can watch some kitties playing instead. Yeah. So, today's Martin Luther King Day here in the United States, and that means that we remember the life and trials and tribulations of not only Martin Luther King Jr., but of all of the Black Americans who suffered during times of terrible social injustice. For me, this day has an extra little asterisk on it, because this day, 12 years ago, my grandfather killed himself. I talked about this in a video that was very well received last year. And that video was about this watch. This particular watch was my grandfather's retirement gift from Consol Energy. Actually, I think this came from the people, not Consol. I have his Consol stuff also. This came from the people that he worked with. They bought him this gift. And he retired on, it appears, October 11th, 1985 is what it says. And it just simply says, "Good luck, Don," on the back. His name was Donald Booth. He was my mother's father. I never met my father's father. He died when my father was very young. He died of a heart attack. And so Grandpa Booth was the only grandpa that I grew up with, the only grandpa that I had. And he was a very gruff man. He lived during the Depression era as a coal miner in Appalachia. He was a moonshiner. He was a alcoholic. He grew up very, very poor, lived a poor life. His house was not nice. He gardened for a lot of his food and canned much of it. My grandmother canned much of it. And I grew up learning a lot from that man. And unfortunately, it was only, in the 6 months leading up to his death that I realized how much I should have learned from him and didn't. And I tried to make up for it in those last 6 months and probably failed. I would like to think that I took a lot of lessons away in those 6 months. But my grandfather was a very grown-up man. I don't want to say he was strict. He wasn't strict, but when we went to his house, it wasn't like we went there to play. I ended up helping him in his garden. We would go fishing together, take, walks down the train tracks and eat stuff from the garden and cut grass and, do grown-up stuff. It wasn't we didn't have the grandchild relationship where we would play blocks together or anything like that. It was do grown-up stuff. I would go to Grandpa's house to pretend to be grown up. And, my grandmother was much older than him, I think by at least 10 or more years. And so she was old when I was a kid. And she died when I was 13 or 12, somewhere around there. And so Grandpa was a person who taught me a lot about life, a lot about working hard, a lot about struggling, a lot about alcoholism and how much I didn't want to be a part of that. He stopped drinking when I was 7 or 8. I told him that if he didn't stop, I'd never talk to him again, and so he stopped. And when he died, when he killed himself, 15 years later or something like that, the beer that was in his fridge on the day that I told him to stop drinking was still in his fridge. He never drank them, but he always kept them. Fall City. He kept them because he said maybe someday he'd like to have one. That day never came. I've told you many times on the show that I suffer from depression. And when I was a teenager, it was really bad. Attempted suicide bad. And so my grandfather was very apprehensive about guns around me. He hunted his whole life. And he was extremely apprehensive about guns. And I joined the Marine Corps. He was very proud of that. Came back and, still just didn't like having guns around me. Kept them all locked up. And when I came back from the Marines, he had remarried. And while I was in the Marine Corps, he started suffering from severe crippling arthritis. And the woman he was married to ended up leaving him. She couldn't take care of him anymore. And it fell on the family to take care of him. So I came back from the Marines, went to school, and I spent every night at his house. I would get his food for the evening, get him to bed, get whatever was needed in the morning for my aunt to show up and make him breakfast. I would set out his bananas or whatever it might be, help him go to the bathroom, all that sort of stuff that a caretaker needs to do. I did for him every evening. And I loved it. I loved every minute of it. I love spending time with the old man that I should have spent time with as a child and should have reflected more on. Instead, it took me all those years to figure that part out, partially because I was mentally unstable when I was a child, and partially because I grew up in the Marine Corps and I learned that those hard values that Grandpa tried to teach me as a child, I should have listened to more, and I should have put more value and weight on them, but I never did. So I spent 6 months trying to catalog his life in my head, trying to understand who he was who he was, why he, drank and abused my grandmother. And unfortunately, I never wrote it down. It's been 15 years now, and I still think about the man. I still feel guilty about the night that he killed himself. You got to put it in. Here's how this works. My grandfather was so sick from arthritis. His hands were just these large masses of, his knuckles were, huge, and his fingers were scrawny. The guy couldn't eat. He was so undernourished. He couldn't even light a cigarette for himself. He could barely lift himself. It was unbelievable that he could do what he did. He killed himself with a shotgun. And the night that he did it, he tried to call my mom. He tried to call my mom. He tried to call my house. And I was on the internet. At that time, we had, dial-up. And I would block incoming calls during that time. And he couldn't get through. He wanted to say goodbye, and he couldn't. Somehow, he was able to kill himself with a shotgun when he couldn't even light his own cigarettes. My uncle cleaned up the mess. I've never been back to his house. I just couldn't. I couldn't go back there. I couldn't help the family move any of his stuff out. And his stuff was divided out, and yeah. I suppose as somebody who suffers from depression, I should have seen it coming. He started giving away a lot of his possessions, like the watch, the week before. He started giving guns to people. I just never questioned the fact when I left that night that the gun was sitting in the corner. That day was Martin Luther King Day, 2002. Mom and I have always said that it was on purpose. My grandfather was a pretty racist guy. He had black friends, but he would say a lot of really racist stuff. And so we always said that he picked Martin Luther King Day as kind of a joke, I guess. I guess you'd have to know the guy. But every year, I should say, when this day comes around, I get a little introspective on the whole event that led up to it. Introspective on my life as a child, how I rebelled against everything that everybody tried to teach me, and how it wasn't until many, many years later that I realized that all of these old people, were just trying to teach me how to be an adult, and I didn't want to listen. And I'm now 37, and I still feel like I'm 15. I still feel like I never learned how to be an adult. When my grandfather gave me this watch, I never wore watches as a kid. I never cared what time it was, and I always told him that. I just don't care. Like, time has no real meaning. It's just an abstraction that humans have created to try to make it easier to communicate about when we're going to do stuff. And he always tried to get me to wear a watch. He bought me pocket watches because I would wear them. When he gave me this watch, he told me I had to wear it. He told me, I'm going to give you this watch under one condition, that you put it on and you wear it. Because a man should always know what time it is. A man should always be punctual. That was his final lesson. It's on my wrist. It's Martin Luther King Day. 15 years later. I still haven't forgotten. I guess there really isn't any point to this story. I don't have a closing statement to tell you that you should hug your loved ones and remember everything they tell you or write it down. I don't have anything like that. I just wanted to let you know that this day, it's very hard for me to be joyous. I try. I really do. I try to work and forget about it. I don't work today. My job's off today, so I try to do personal work and just kind of let it pass. And, tomorrow will be a normal day. But I think it's important to reflect on times like this as a person so that you don't ever fall into that hole where you just can't get out of it because life's become too difficult. If you feel that way, or if you think your family members feel that way, please find somebody who will listen and talk. Reach out to them, because there's no reason to go out of this world feeling alone. Thanks for watching.